Civil War is directed by Alex Garland, starring Kirsten Dunst, Wagner Moira, amongst other people. Set in the not-too-distant future, and a second civil war is brewing all across the United States. Kirsten Dunst is a journalist on the ground documenting everything that's happening in her path, trying to navigate her way towards Washington, D.C. before it's overrun by the Western forces. And what ensues for the rest of the movie is a road trip/war film that is at times extremely horrifying to look at. The first time I took notice of this movie was when Kirsten Dunst shared on her Instagram profile the new movie she was going to be in. I looked up the premise and I thought, there is no way that movie is not going to be relevant for today. I mean, for anyone who's been living under a rock for the past decade or so, America in particular has been very divided. The divisiveness has basically permeated our everyday lives in their own various ways. And for this movie to come out during an election year, I think it's a perfect time for a movie like this to come out, while also very risky. There's a lot of people that are hoping for a second civil war to happen. I even know a couple of people who are preparing themselves with underground bunkers and weapons and all that kind of stuff. Kind of like Bill in The Last of Us, which, believe it or not, Nick Offerman, who plays him in the show, is in this movie as the president, albeit in a very small part. And this film is brought to us by Alex Garland, the man behind certain films like Annihilation and Ex Machina, the latter of which I have seen. I think it had a lot of interesting ideas, but I don't remember feeling fully grasped by the overall premise by the time it was over. This was a long time ago that I saw it. I think it was 2015 or 16 when I watched it. I was just kind of navigating my way through the YouTube sphere, so my media literacy wasn't really what it is right now. But with certain internet discussion circles, the discourse around Alex Garland, he's someone that I think is really interested in tackling certain ideas, but some people feel like he doesn't grasp the idea that he's going for, that he bites off more than he can chew. With Civil War, I think he keeps it very simplistic. I've heard some people argue that he was overreaching with certain ideas that he had in mind, particularly with the character played by Jesse Plemons. More on that guy later, trust me. And we'll talk about this as we go on, but I think it's also the movie's biggest strength, although I did kind of wish that we had more of an explanation as to what's happening. Just a thing with my personal intrigue. I may or may not reveal certain details, particularly with Jesse Plemons' character. Other than that, I'll do my best to keep my spoilers to a minimum. Kirsten Dunst's character, Lee, has been through a lot of different conflicts throughout the world, taking various photographs of certain atrocities that she's witnessed before her eyes, and Kirsten Dunst is able to perfectly convey the whole "I've seen some you-know-what" look without being too showy for the camera. You can clearly see that she's seen a lot of stuff that's really gotten to her, keeping it very contained when she's around other people, except when she has a moment to herself in the bathroom, for instance, she does in a way start to let her guard down, because after a while, that kind of stuff does get to you. I've never experienced combat or anything, but I've spoken with people who have been in combat situations: Iraq, Afghanistan, Vietnam, and even the Second World War. No matter how much counseling you may go through to get yourself help for that kind of stuff never leaves you. The team of journalists that she's with consists of Kaylee Spaney, Jesse Cullen, Stephen McKinley Henderson as Sammy, who's a veteran journalist for the New York Times, and her colleague Joel, played by Wagner Moira, who basically lives for the thrill of being in the thick of the action. Jesse is completely green and unprepared for what they're about to see, and the journey that she goes through in this movie is not something that we haven't really seen before, but by the time her arc ends at the finale, I found it to be effectively tragic. Them being set in New York City at the start of the movie, you would think that it'd be easy to just go down I-95 into Washington, D.C., since it's practically a straight shot. But due to I-95 being completely destroyed in the conflict, they gotta go all the way around through Pennsylvania, my home state, mind you, and back through Charlottesville, Virginia, and then they'd find their way into D.C. And as they make their way through these various areas and back roads, they find themselves in so many situations where I know for myself, I was on the edge of my seat practically the entire time. There were definitely a couple of moments where you could just sit back and relax for a few minutes, but then we cut to the next morning and the tension starts to get higher and higher. The trailers are really solid at not showing you everything that happens, because there are some truly horrific images in here. And I'm not talking about the levels of like Hacksaw Ridge or Saving Private Ryan, although it does get kind of close to that in some areas. The comparison that comes to mind for me is Christopher Nolan's Dunkirk, the psychological element of it all, along with the fact that it's really just about war and how horrifying it can be when you're stuck in the middle of it, especially when you don't know exactly who is out there as a threat. The one person that's around the corner could be some nationalists trying to get their claws into you, and the other person just down the road could be a Western forces loyalist of some kind. The Western forces, as I mentioned, California and Texas. While we're on that subject, the fact that Texas and California are in an alliance with each other, if you were to try to apply that in the real world, there is no way in hell that is possible. California is the most liberal democratic state that you'll ever run into. I'd say even more so than the state of New York. Texas is the most conservative Republican state that you'll run into. besides maybe Florida. Now, the movie doesn't really go into why the alliance is there in the first place, which I think is fairly excusable. But when you start to apply this into the real world, it really does not add up. Segueing into this whole conflict that's brewing across the United States, or what's left of it, the movie doesn't really explain how the conflict started in the first place, and I think it's the film's biggest saving grace and strength. It could have easily taken a stance on either side, left or right. I wouldn't have had a problem with that necessarily, but even then, no matter how much you presented it or how moderate you may have come off here, trying to look at it from the perspective of Alex Garland, I don't know what his political views are, but I would imagine it probably was not easy for him to kind of go in a certain area of how he felt about the current political landscape right now. And even though this movie is getting an overall positive reception, I've seen some pretty divisive responses towards this. It was bound to upset some people no matter what it did. I could be totally wrong on this one, but I think Alex Garland's intention was to leave the origins of the war to the viewer's imagination, where it's sure to be more terrifying and outrageous. I think in that way, it's like the original Star Wars film, A New Hope. Taking all the context of the prequels and sequels out of the picture, all we're really told at the beginning of the movie through the opening crawl, there's an empire that's ruling the galaxy, a rebellion is trying to fight back, and there's a super weapon that the Empire is using to wipe out any planet that doesn't bow down to their rule. And if the rebels don't destroy the Death Star, a lot of innocent people are gonna die. It's a very simplistic plot, good guys versus bad guys. And this movie I think takes a similar approach, except without the whole good guys versus bad guys. Because if you've seen this movie, you can't really tell who can be trusted and who can't. Kind of like The Last of Us as well, where you're not really sure if the next survivor that you run into is going to help you or not. I'm making a lot of comparisons to various pieces of fiction, but with this movie, it's really gotten my brain rolling with certain things and how I was able to process what I saw. Because this movie in a way does not really pull any punches, bringing us into the scene with Jesse Plemons, who is uncredited in this movie. They show him in the trailer for a reason. Where I first recognized Jesse Plemons from his part as Ox in Like Mike, where he's the bully and he rips apart that 76ers jersey with Allen Iverson's name on the back. What a jackass. Then years later, he shows up as Todd from Breaking Bad, and that character was just completely despicable. Major props to Jesse Plemons, though, for playing that character like he did. And the same thing goes for here. He has this thing about him where he is scary, but in a very casual manner, and you don't really know what he might do. Minor spoilers in here. And the one person who's with Jesse gives him an answer he doesn't like, and he just casually shoots him right in the chest. I haven't had this kind of visceral reaction to something that I was watching in a movie in a long time. I audibly said someone out loud, "Mother of God." And a couple people a few seats away from me to my right were saying a similar thing. One last thing about that sequence, someone in that group is shot and killed. And it's a very effective way of showing the reactions to losing their one friend, because all Alex Garland uses is the music. Similar to Order of the Phoenix when Harry Potter sees his one friend getting killed right in front of him. For about maybe 2 minutes after that scene, I could tell other people were having a similar response. I sat there going like this. I also really like how the movie doesn't go too overboard with the violence. Other war films that we've seen in the past, like Saving Private Ryan or Hacksaw Ridge, they use blood and gore, but that's all done for a reason. It's meant to show you just how horrible war is, and the kind of weapons that were used on both sides can really cause a lot of damage to the human body. But now in the modern era, or in this case 2024 when this movie has been released, how warfare is conducted has changed. And there are certain scenes where we see combat up close, attempting to get pictures of certain people getting shot at or shooting at enemy combatants on this balcony above, along with certain song choices that I found to be very jarring at first. After hearing certain people talk about it, it was trying to go for like a Vietnam War type of feel with a modern soundtrack, because if you were to see movies like Platoon or Full Metal Jacket, they would play songs that were popular at that current time frame in the 60s. Gimme Shelter, Paint It Black, All Along the Watchtower, or any song by Jefferson Airplane. I don't know any of the song choices that were used in here, but it definitely feels very modern. Kind of felt tonally out of place for one scene, but after that I was able to let it go. It's not too often that we get the perspective of war from a correspondent or a journalist. The closest example I can think of is Full Metal Jacket with Matthew Modine's character. This situation, they're completely impartial to what's happening, or at least they're attempting to remain impartial because their job is to just document facts on the ground. The media, unfortunately, has been viewed in a negative light for the last 10 or 20 years because of certain biases that we see with CNN or Fox News. These people are just journalists trying to present what's going on in the ground, showing the facts right in front of them. Also playing into the apolitical nature of the entire picture. And some are probably not going to sit well with that. They're going to say that it was too cowardly to not take a stance either way. And that's also evident with Nick Offerman's character as the president, who is said to be very dictatorial as he's serving a third term in office, which you could read either way as Democratic or Republican. And the movie doesn't even say what party he's with anyway. He's only in there for like 2 scenes, beginning and end, but one thing's for sure, he definitely serves his purpose. And even though this is a fictional conflict, this is probably the best depiction of combat that I've seen in a while, probably since Hacksaw Ridge and Dunkirk. I would even put this up there with other films like that, along with Saving Private Ryan, Lone Survivor even, and I just remembered Band of Brothers. Even though that's a miniseries, its portrayal of combat has been praised by critics and historians, and even veterans of the Second World War. And I do have to point out the one scene which is shown in the trailer when they go see this town that's almost like going back in time to an era where there wasn't so much divisiveness, and the main characters are very perplexed by what they're seeing. I think it also plays into the film's message of trying to be a warning of some kind to people who are so into the political divisiveness, because these people in this town are trying to stay out of all the chaos and act like it's not happening. Which I'll admit, I do that to varying degrees, because I know certain people personally, like my own father, who watches Fox News almost on a daily basis as of late. And he's not the only one. I know plenty of other people who do that stuff with Fox News and CNN. But what I think that Alex Garland is trying to communicate here, at least this is what I took away from it, the conflict has been going on for so long that people seem to forget why it started in the first place. And at least in my experience in the real world, it seems like people have kind of gotten used to it. And we seem to forget a certain time when we were not so concerned about all that stuff. And I think ultimately this movie is serving as a warning. Like it's saying, look, what we're experiencing right now, this could be us in the future. Don't let it get to that point. I may or may not be reading too much into this, but that's basically what I took away from it. So at the end of the day, Civil War might be one of the best movies I've seen in the last few years. Maybe even so far the best movie I've seen this year. Regardless of where you stand politically, I would definitely recommend this to anybody who's interested, especially if you're in the least bit curious. And the characters, while they have very simplistic arcs, they all have their purpose throughout the story. And Kirsten Dunst, I personally think she deserves a lot more credit than she gets. And this movie serves as no exception for her. If you are going to check this out, prepare yourself. You're in for a hell of a ride. Those are my thoughts on Civil War. Thank you guys so much for watching. Comment below and tell me what your thoughts are on this movie if you've seen it. And as always, see you in the next one.